Hi, it's Katrina. Ahnenerbe. Adolf Hitler created the Ahnenerbe in 1935 as a special operation think tank. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, was involved, and so were many of the top scholars and scientists in Germany. The point behind the think tank was mostly propaganda. The top scientists were charged with figuring out how to promote Hitler's racial doctrines, promote the Nazi Party, redefine Christianity, and how to convince all of Germany that they belonged to the biologically superior race called the Aryans. This was a type of mind control experiment put together to brainwash the public. One of Hitler's biggest problems was that none of the mainstream scientists actually believed his theory. There is no superior Aryan race, and yet Hitler bold-faced lied about history. He said that it was the Aryans who invented agriculture, art, the first writing system, and every other important thing in the world. It was all nonsense. And this was where the Ahnenerbe came into play. It was their job to provide evidence for the Nazi racial doctrine. Then these ideas were to be promoted through books, exhibits, conferences, and anything else that would get the people interested in and believing in his imaginary world. And it actually worked. People in times of financial crisis are vulnerable, and the Nazis put a lot of effort into their scheme. By the time the war broke out, Hitler was able to use his Aryan superiority theory to justify his multiple atrocities. Because he claimed that archaeological evidence showed the Aryans had lived in Eastern Europe in prehistory, he used that as justification for expanding his military in the region. He also used the Aryan superiority card for exterminating groups like the Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, and others considered by the Nazis as undesirables. The parachute experiment. Archaeologists have just solved the mystery of a British aircraft from World War II that crashed when a secret mission went horribly wrong. The aircraft was discovered near the small village of Ballykelly in England. It's a Beaufort AW271, and it came barreling out of the sky in April 1942. The 3 men on board were killed, and the debris was quickly gathered to prevent classified equipment from accidentally falling into the enemy's hands. But even though they took most of the equipment away, they left the scraps that didn't matter to them. And now, aviation archaeologist Johnny McNee has found these scraps, buried under decades of dirt. According to Mr. McNee, the airplane had been involved in an experiment to see if an injured airman could safely parachute out of a plane. It wasn't the most important experiment in the war, but would have been useful information to the hundreds of fighter pilots putting their lives at risk. The test was carried out by pushing a dummy with a parachute out of a hatch, but it all went horribly wrong when the parachute deployed immediately outside the plane, wrapping itself around the tail and bringing the aircraft crashing to the ground. Sadly, it exploded, killing everyone involved. The Ghent Altarpiece. On the night of April 10, 1934, one of the 12 oak panels which make up the famous painting Adoration of the Mystic Lamb was stolen. This was one of the most famous paintings by Jan van Eyck and had been stored in Belgium at the St. Bavo Cathedral. The missing piece is now referred to as the Ghent Altarpiece, and it was one of the most coveted pieces of art by the Nazis during the war. A desire among those to have the painting included Hitler and Hermann Göring, who had been his second in command. These 2 men challenged one another to see who could steal the altarpiece first. Hitler used the Nazi art theft unit to capture the piece of artwork from where it was hiding at the Château de Pau in France. But then Göring got it and brought it to his massive stolen art collection, which included about 7,000 masterpieces pilfered throughout the war. When Hitler learned of this, he sent his own men to intercept and retrieve the altarpiece. He then had it brought to a storage facility in the Austrian Alps, where he had 12,000 of the most famous artworks in Europe kept in secret. This place was Hitler's top-secret super museum, about the size of a city, filled with more art than the Louvre is today. But the oddest part about this entire operation, wasting resources to steal artwork, was Hitler's motivation behind it. Rumor has it that Hitler thought this particular painting contained a secret map to lost Christian treasures. He believed this one piece of artwork would lead him to the Arma Christi, the instruments of Christ's crucifixion, the crown of thorns, the Holy Grail, and the Spear of Destiny. It was Hitler's belief that any man who possessed all 3 artifacts would be granted supernatural powers. Operation Fortitude South. Operation Fortitude South was one of the most crucial operations of the entire war. It was the beginning of the biggest operation in military history, the liberation of Western Europe. Operation Fortitude South was aimed at deception. The Allies wanted to trick the German High Command into believing that they would land their troops in Pas-de-Calais after passing over the Strait of Dover. In reality, they would actually land in Normandy with about 133,000 soldiers. They did this as carefully as possible to really trick the German High Command. The first thing they had going for them was that they had already secretly cracked the coding system for the Enigma machine, and the Germans didn't know. They thought their secret communication system could never be broken, but the Allies had already started using it against them. Next, the Allies controlled many double agents that they could use to influence the German High Command. And so these things came together to fool the Germans, which allowed D-Day to happen the way it did. It was still brutal fighting, but it could have been a lot worse. The Germans diverted much of their forces away from Normandy to Greece, allowing the biggest bulk of Allied soldiers to breach the defenses without all the power of Germany raining down on them. This D-Day deception helped change history as we know it. Assassinating the Loch Ness Monster. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels tried to kill the Loch Ness Monster in 1940 in one of the weirder Nazi plots of the war. He didn't literally try to assassinate the Loch Ness Monster. Instead, he tried to discredit the beast as a hoax so that he could destroy tourism revenue. It was all incredibly strange, but then again, so were many things the Nazis did. The Loch Ness Monster had been considered a biological mystery since 1933. That was roughly the time that reports of a strange and unknown monster began coming in from Loch Ness in Scotland. Joseph Goebbels used the bizarre obsession that had risen around the monster to make the people of the United Kingdom look foolish. He said in a German newspaper that if people believed in a primeval beast living in a lake, there was no way they were smart enough to win a war. He said the people of England and Scotland were dumb for believing in a dinosaur and basically smashed the Loch Ness Monster's reputation to bits. Even Benito Mussolini got in on the action. He published a story about an Italian pilot who bombed the lake in 1941 and blew Nessie apart. Seems like all of this was a waste of time and resources, but you just never know why they decided to waste their energy on this monster in particular. Operation Downfall and Operation Kyushu. One of the most terrifying parts of World War II was about as far from Europe as you can get. D-Day was scary, but it would have been nothing compared to what would have happened if the Americans tried to take Japan by force. It would have been a bloodbath of unimaginable proportions. Operation Downfall was the name for the proposed invasion of Japan. The Americans wanted to use the recently captured island of Okinawa as a staging area. The plan was to take the island in 1945, follow up with the southern island of Kyushu, and then, in early 1946, invade the Kanto Plain and move in on Tokyo. The Japanese had their own plan of defense, Operation Kyushu. This was the defense of Japan by every single Japanese civilian. The Japanese leaders knew they were in a tough spot, and they knew exactly where the Americans would invade, if it came to an invasion. And because they rejected surrender, they were going to fight back to the very last citizen. In early 1945, the Japanese armed forces bolstered their numbers to about 6 million. But when it looked like the Americans were about to invade, they boosted those numbers to about 20 million. Every man between the age of 15 and 60, and every woman between the ages of 17 and 40. They were all prepared to fight, every single civilian, to the death if the Americans invaded. If it hadn't been for the atomic bomb, the death count would have been insane. The only way the Americans would have won the fight was over the bodies of hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers and millions of Japanese civilians. Nazi experiments. It's never been confirmed that the Nazis tried to make zombies. However, we know the Nazis took part in brutal medical experiments on thousands of prisoners, and a lot of them were absolutely horrifying. Most of their experiments surrounded 3 topics: survival, drugs and treatments, and advanced racial ideological ideas. The Nazis tested pretty much anything they could think of on the prisoners of their concentration camps. They exposed them to contagious diseases and then tested new immunization compounds and antibodies. They even tried things like bone grafting and exposed them to mustard gas to test different antidotes. But it gets even worse. They wanted to test the limits of human survival using unwilling prisoners. For example, they wanted to see what the maximum altitude was that a person could parachute to safety. So they threw prisoners out of airplanes to see. They also wanted to figure out how to make drinkable seawater. And what better way to do that than test their concoctions on their prisoners? They would force them to drink salt water until they died. The Ghost Army. The Ghost Army was one of the more interesting secret military operations from World War II. This army was specifically put together to trick enemy soldiers using inflatable tanks, sound effects, loudspeakers, and whatever else they had at their disposal. This Ghost Army didn't actually engage with the enemy. Instead, it was composed of about 1,100 American artists, engineers, and designers. They were hoping to help win the war by staging realistic battle equipment to confuse Nazi Germany. The location and size of the Allied forces were fooling the Axis forces. They would deploy inflatable decoys, create fake radio chatter, and simulate a force over 30 times larger than what was really there. They would operate within a quarter mile of enemy lines, and they got away with almost everything they did. According to a report from the U.S. Army, rarely has there ever been a group of such few men who had such a great influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. The Ghost Army was active from D-Day to the Battle of the Bulge, went on over 20 missions, and helped deter Nazi attacks that saved thousands of lives. V-1 Flying Bomb. Hitler's V-weapons were some of the most terrifying weapons from World War II. The German V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket were called revenge weapons, designed specifically to be used in retaliation in the latter parts of the war. The idea behind the V-weapons was to undermine public morale, terrorize British civilians, and scare the British so badly that they would eventually just give up fighting. But of course, we now know that it didn't work. These weapons were so terrifying that even though they were conceived in the 1930s, the first V-1 launch site didn't appear in northern France until 1943. The V-1 was the very first operational cruise missile to be fired from a launch ramp. It was like an airplane with no pilot, which used an extra noisy pulse jet engine. It traveled at about 400 miles an hour, crossing the English Channel in minutes using a basic form of autopilot connected to a small propeller. The propeller was used to clock how far the weapon had gone. It carried a 1-ton explosive payload and was incredibly inaccurate. The first V-1 flying bomb wasn't launched until June 13, 1944. That was after the Allies had already stormed the beaches in Normandy. After that, about 10,000 flying bombs were sent directly toward Britain, causing about 6,000 deaths. Nobody knew where these things were going to hit, and the city became so dangerous over 1 million people left London trying to get out of range of Hitler's terrifying new weapon. Thankfully, by autumn of that year, new advancements in anti-aircraft technology rendered the V-1 flying bombs virtually useless, and soon after, the war was over. Operation Bernhard. When the Nazis weren't busy stealing artwork or trashing mythological monsters, they were forging currency. Operation Bernhard was the secret plot to completely collapse the British economy in the middle of the war. What the Nazis wanted to do was forge British banknotes on an enormous scale. Next, they would drop millions of these banknotes over Britain in a rainstorm of money, which would ultimately collapse the economy. The unit did successfully duplicate the paper used by the British to print their money. They even produced almost identical engraving blocks, as well as mimicking the algorithm used to create the serial code on each banknote. They were able to duplicate British money so effectively that they printed at least 300 million British pounds, then laundered the money and used it in the war effort. That's basically like forging $1 billion in today's economy. The Germans then used all of that cash to pay their war bills, while the money flooded into the British economy. Enough bills ended up in circulation that when the war finished, the Bank of England had to release fresh notes and issued totally new designs. It didn't break the economy, but it came awfully close. Ancient Viking Shipyard. On the Swedish island of Björkö, archaeologists have come across an exciting Viking shipyard, which is revealing secrets about how the Vikings were able to build such incredible boats, and travel such long distances. They made the discovery while excavating Birka, which is commonly referenced as the very first town ever established in Sweden. It was built during the middle of the 8th century on the shores of Lake Mälaren, which grew to become a major trading hub. Over the years, it turned into a densely populated city. It was filled with merchants and travelers from all over, moving across Europe and into the lands beyond. The excavation was conducted by scientists with Stockholm University. They uncovered strange depressions in the ground lined with stone, and then discovered a wooden boat hiding at the very bottom. They also found boat rivets, whetstones, woodworking tools, and other artifacts to suggest this was a shipyard, a place where boats were actually built to take Viking warriors on their raids across Europe. The biggest reason this is so exciting is that according to Professor Sven Isaacson, a site like this has never been found before. It's the first shipyard ever uncovered, a truly remarkable find in the world of Viking history. Viking ships had a huge advantage over other ships from their time period thanks to their speed, weight, and ability to withstand fierce ocean storms. Technological advancements in cities like Birka helped scale the production of these ships and led to the golden age of the Viking era. King Bluetooth. Satellite images have revealed that the great Viking king, Harald Bluetooth, could very well be buried in a small Polish village. He was real, and now we know where he was buried. Harald Bluetooth was the inspiration behind the name for wireless Bluetooth technology. He actually got the name because he had a tooth so dead it had turned dark blue. He was also a merciless warlord and the king of Denmark and Norway in the 10th century. However, his burial site has been lost for 1,000 years, and nobody has ever been able to find it until possibly now. Satellite remote sensing tools have revealed a massive burial mound in the small Polish village of Wiewkowko. The burial mound appears to come from the 10th century, and it's big enough that it probably belonged to someone of extreme importance. We know Harald Bluetooth was likely buried in the area, but the only issue is that researchers don't exactly have a way to positively identify his remains. It's not like they have his fingerprints or DNA on record or anything. Another piece of evidence came nearly a decade ago in 2014. A gold disc was discovered in the area inscribed with a mention of a great Viking king, found just 3 miles from the burial mound. These two things put together seem to suggest that Harald Bluetooth has been here the entire time. Sadly, researchers haven't been able to actually excavate the burial mound to see if the king's body is still in there. 2 pieces of the sword. An amateur treasure hunter in Norway discovered a small piece of metal that appeared to be mostly worthless. He made the discovery on a farm on the western coast of Norway, and nobody really knew what the thing was. A year later, a totally different amateur archaeologist, a treasure hunter who happens to be a friend of the first one, discovered something else. They found the hilt of a large Viking sword, and as it turned out, the sword and the random piece of metal were part of the same artifact. Finally, the 2 pieces were reunited after spending 1,200 years apart, thanks to friendship. The sword is called a D-sword, according to Anne-Jeanette Gelstad from the University of Oslo. She explained that it was one of the most skillfully ornamented and heaviest swords ever used by the Vikings. The small metal piece matched up perfectly with the hilt, creating one solid artifact. The blade is gone now, lost somewhere else, but researchers were still able to identify the relic. Even more fascinating is that this sword is one of about 20 similar artifacts that have been discovered in Norway. Researchers believe these swords were probably imported and may have actually been forged in England or Francia and then taken with the Vikings to their home in Norway. Mysterious Viking Cave. Excavations carried out by the Archaeological Institute of Iceland have turned up something strange near the tiny Icelandic village of Oddi. From the 10th to the 11th centuries, Oddi was a major city. It was the seat of power of the great Odaverjar clan during the period of the medieval Icelandic Commonwealth. One of the most famous members of the clan was Simundur the Learned, who wrote some of the earliest recorded histories of the kings of Norway. The small settlement became a major cultural center, not just an ordinary Viking trading hub. In 2018, some man-made caves were discovered here. The discovery sparked 2 years of study, And researchers have discovered a much larger cave which connects to an even bigger cave system. Researchers believe it was probably a stall used for holding cattle or horses. It seemed like it may have been something exciting, like a mysterious shrine or some kind of dark cave where Vikings performed ancient rituals. But nope. This part was a man-made cave where the Vikings kept their livestock. Even though the cave may have had a simple explanation, it was mentioned in something called the Legends of Saints, written between 1210 and 1250. One of the legends described a man-made cave which collapsed while there were 12 bulls inside, and only one animal was miraculously rescued from the destruction. Archaeologists don't know if this cave is the one from legend, but it definitely could be. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Barbara, Sorgdragger, and Try School for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about recent discoveries. Viking Coins. An amateur treasure hunter with a metal detector came across a cache of silver coins and jewelry in southwest Finland. According to a report from the Finnish Heritage Agency, the coins once belonged to Vikings in the 10th century. The coins actually go back to the days of the Great Harald Bluetooth. 12 of them were found to be minted by the Viking king himself, which historians found amazing since so few of these coins have been found in Finland. Oskari Heikkilä, the amateur treasure hunter who discovered the coins, said the treasure was literally shaking in his hands. He understood the significance of what he had found and was in shock. He immediately stopped digging, left everything else exactly where it was, and reported the discovery to the authorities. The following week, professional archaeologists came to do trial excavations. We now know that the coins had probably been inside a leather bag. The archaeologists also found pieces of pottery from the Iron Age, suggesting someone may have actually lived here. This could have been a person's house, but it's hard to say. All we know is that somebody lost or buried a leather satchel full of coins 1,000 years ago, but never came back. The Gelstad Viking ship. In 2018, the Gelstad Viking ship burial site was discovered in the eastern part of Norway. In the last few years, researchers have been rushing to get out everything they possibly can before time and the elements ruin the site. The excavations of the burial site have been a huge success. Researchers have discovered wooden fragments from the ship that was buried in the ground for 1,000 years, horse teeth, and even one giant amber bead. The bead has a huge hole in it, which was probably used for a chain to pass through, and may have been attached to the sheath of a great warrior sword. The researchers believe it was put in the burial ship to help protect the dead from the dangers of the afterlife. Just north from where the ship was buried, archaeologists have also uncovered a collection of ancient longhouses, suggesting a large settlement had once been here. In total, this Viking ship burial has produced 8,000 pieces of iron and copper. Most of it is scraps, building materials from the ship, and rusty iron nails. One of the biggest mysteries is the identity of the person buried in the boat. They were undoubtedly a Viking elite, but we don't know if it was a ruler or a fearsome fighter. 2 Viking axes were found at the site, one of them positively enormous, so the person buried here was probably huge. Sadly though, much of the good stuff had already been stolen by grave robbers before researchers got to the ship in 2018. The ship and the surrounding soil is in chunks at a university, slowly getting taken apart in the lab, and researchers are still holding out that there might be some surprises. Viking Skeletons. In an incredible scientific discovery, Viking skeletons found in different countries have turned out to be related. One skeleton was discovered in central Denmark and the other in England. Both skeletons belong to men who died about 1,000 years ago. Genetic testing done by Copenhagen University geneticist Eske Willerslev has proven that these 2 men, who died in different countries a millennium ago, were probably half-brothers. And now, all these centuries later, the brothers have been reunited at the Oxfordshire Museum, where they lie in glass display cases, their empty eye sockets staring at one another. But how in the world did these 2 brothers end up so far apart when they died? Researchers say that Danish Vikings reached both Scotland and England in the 8th century. This was when they showed up as raiders, pillaging coastal villages, and some even settling in woodland areas in small communities. It was during these voyages when the Vikings sailed all the way to North America. In 2008, one of the skeletons was found in Oxford in a mass grave with 35 other Viking settlers. All these men had been killed, probably on the orders of the great medieval king of England, Ethelred. The other man died on the small Danish island of Funen and had lived into his 50s. Arthritis and rib inflammation on the skeleton showed that he had probably lived a hard life as a farmer. So back to the original question. It looks like the two brothers may have been fathered by different men, and for whatever reason, ended up taking two vastly different paths in life. One ended up raiding England and was killed for it, and the other lived a long life as a farmer and died in his homeland. Viking women on the Isle of Man. A pair of ancient brooches, each one over 1,000 years old, have been discovered on the Isle of Man. They've made a pretty big splash in local historic circles, because up until now, nobody thought there had been any women Vikings on the island. It was assumed that around the year 800, Viking men settled on the island, but never brought any women with them. They used the place as a kind of outpost between Britain and Ireland. Now, with the discovery of these brooches, historians believe they belonged to women, and so they need to reassess how they view the Isle of Man's Viking history. It's clear that Scandinavian women definitely lived here, or at least visited the place, since they haven't been found in any graves. It's just not clear how big of a settlement we're dealing with, or just exactly how many women may have lived on the island. Mysterious crystal jar. The Galloway hoard, discovered by a man with a metal detector in 2014, is one of the biggest Viking hoards ever discovered in Scotland. It consists of over 100 pieces of gold, silver, glass, crystal, and stone. There is jewelry, treasure, and the most mixed collection of trinkets from the Viking Age ever found. There was one artifact specifically that gained a lot of attention from researchers. It's a jar made of rock crystal covered in wrappings of gold. It's an amazing artifact that dates back far before the Viking hoard was actually buried. According to researchers, it was probably a gift from the Roman Empire given to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom in Britain far before the Vikings ever showed up. The jar isn't very big, but it shows some of the best gold work that's ever been found, dating from over 1,000 years ago. The jar was probably used to hold perfume or liquid, something of immense value, and it was almost definitely made prior to the Galloway hoard in the year 900. An inscription on the bottom reads, "Bishop Hygald had me made." In simple terms, it was made by the Romans, given as a gift to the Anglo-Saxons, and then later stolen by the Vikings and buried in a treasure hoard. Elite boat burial. An elite burial boat has been found hidden 30 feet under solid ground in Norway. It was only discovered thanks to researchers using ground-penetrating radar. They identified a boat about 30 feet long and 5 feet wide, big enough to carry 6 Vikings on a raid. As of right now, the boat appears to have been used in the burial of a high-ranking Viking. That means that there is a tomb under the ground here, which researchers will have to dig down to investigate. They only have the shape of the boat now on the radar, but can clearly see it's big enough that only someone of major importance would have been buried inside. Unfortunately, nobody knows anything about the person buried in the boat. That being said, other Viking boat burials have been identified in the area, and this one seems to be the biggest. The other ones were all reserved for extremely important people, so this means this individual was probably the most important. The thing about boat burials is that they were expensive. Imagine being buried in a brand new convertible. That was the kind of extravagance that being buried in the boat was to the Vikings. This is why only the top brass had such luxurious graves. Otherwise, there would be boats hidden across half of Europe. Stalins Monkey Men. Secret documents from the 1920s have been released that apparently show evidence that Joseph Stalin assembled a team of Planet of the Apes-style warriors that were allegedly a cross between apes and humans. He wanted to create an elite army of soldiers that would be half ape, half human. Stalin ordered the top animal breeding scientist in all of Russia, Ilya Ivanov, to stop breeding horses and start breeding super warriors. The soldiers had to be unresponsive to pain, able to eat absolutely anything, and fight to the very brink of death in order to meet his agenda. The orders were passed down to create a living war machine. at a time when Russian society was rapidly advancing. Ivanov was on board because he wanted to create the hybrid ape army as an attempt to discredit creationists. Remember, the communists were very anti-religion. Ivanov was given a budget of $200,000 in order to try and impregnate chimpanzees with human sperm. The experiments were supposedly carried out in 1926 at the Pasteur Institute in Conakry, Guinea, which was top secret at the time. Ivanov artificially inseminated 3 chimpanzees. However, as you can probably guess, it didn't turn out the way Stalin had hoped. Instead of getting a Tarzan-type warrior man, one of the monkeys died, and the rest didn't give birth to anything. The experiment failed, and he decided to try and inseminate a Russian woman with ape sperm instead, which was also unsuccessful. When the donor monkey Tarzan passed away, the whole experiment was called off. In the end, no superior monkey men were born, and Stalin had to put a stop to his demented plans. Project Stargate. Project Stargate was the code name for a series of human experiments conducted by the CIA in the 1970s. At the time, they believed that the Soviet Union was spending millions of dollars researching ESP and other supernatural human abilities. They explored the use of telepathy, reading someone's thoughts, and remote viewing, which allows a person to view a time or place without being there in person. We still don't know for sure if the Soviet Union was trying to figure out how to control human minds, but the CIA definitely wanted to get ahead of them if they were. The competition between the two countries was at an all-time high, and they both sought to outdo the other. After all, America's competitive attitude was how we got to the moon before anyone else. The CIA began their experiments in 1972, when they funded a program known as Scanate, which focused on the research of mind control. They started testing remote viewing at the Stanford Research Institute in California that same year. Those involved were renowned physicists, Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff. The two men chose gifted individuals, people claiming to be psychics, and started putting them to the test. One of these individuals was celebrity psychic Uri Geller, who was known for his ability to bend spoons with his mind. According to CIA documents, Geller was locked in a room for 8 days in August of 1973, where multiple experiments were conducted on him. The testing proved to be a success, and they concluded that he had adequately proved his paranormal perceptual ability in a convincing and ambiguous manner. The project then caught the eye of the U.S. Department of Defense, and Ray Hyman, a psychology professor for the University of Oregon, was called in to evaluate Geller. He found the man to be a fraud and said that he could see inconsistencies and loopholes in the acts Geller could perform. Nonetheless, Congress continued to fund the research. The project continued until 1984, and one of the last missions they completed involved a remote viewing of Mars. Joseph McMoneagle, an Army veteran, was recruited, and he reported seeing very large, thin people wearing some kind of strange clothes, obelisks, and pyramids. Although Project Stargate was somewhat successful, by 1995 the program went into a quick decline when the CIA reported that remote viewing shouldn't be used operationally. Ultimately, the whole thing was shut down. However, psychics around the world continue to practice the techniques used in these missions. Project Lucifer. October 15, 1997 was a big day for science. The Cassini-Huygens mission took off from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station with one purpose: to explore Saturn and its moons. The tiny exploration vehicle was powered by 72 pounds of plutonium fuel, which was supposedly needed because anything beyond Mars cannot be powered using solar panels. It's just too far away from the sun. There is a pretty crazy conspiracy theory that says plutonium is actually used for something else. None of this is verified by any legitimate government source, but there are rumors that have been circulating for years. It all has to do with something called Project Lucifer. The project was dreamed up by NASA in association with secretive global organizations like the Illuminati and the Freemasons. They're hoping to use plutonium to set off a bomb on the surface of Saturn. The idea is that the atmospheric pressure on Saturn will be so immense that when the probe breaches it, the plutonium will condense and detonate like a nuclear bomb. The hope is that this explosion will create a chain reaction, turning Saturn into the biggest bomb in the universe. It will create a nuclear fusion, and Saturn will turn into its very own star. It would be kind of like a secondary sun. This would be chaos for the Earth, as it would kill billions of people from the increase of radiation. However, Saturn's moon, Titan, would remarkably be in the perfect position to suddenly become habitable with its close proximity to Saturn. Those in power, who know the Earth is dying, would then flee to Saturn on their spaceships. It's a pretty wacky idea, but some people are convinced. They believe the government is working with the Illuminati to make an escape plan off of Earth before the planet starts dying. The Report from Iron Mountain. The Report from Iron Mountain was a book published in 1967 by Dial Press. The contents of the book were supposedly written by a group of 15 men who kept their identities secret and still remain anonymous to this very day. It was never intended to be released to the public. However, it became a New York Times bestseller. The book has been translated into 15 languages, and nobody has any idea if it's real or a hoax. The issue is that the book apparently details very real conversations in which elite government officials discuss methods for remaining in power. The men who wrote the book were allegedly part of a special study group, which was assembled in 1963 to examine what might happen if the United States of America went into a long period of peace. In other words, if the US didn't get involved in a war for an extended amount of time. They met inside Iron Mountain, a secret underground nuclear bunker, and they worked out the details there. The group concluded that peace was not in the best interest of a stable economy for America. They also decided that if lasting peace could be achieved, it would come as a detriment to society. War was necessary in order to fuel the economy, to divert collective aggression, and keep the government in control. Their recommendation was to create some kind of war substitute that could still spin the economy while diverting the attention of the masses from the gross pollution of the environment. Distraction was necessary, and the bigger and bloodier the better. To this day, nobody is sure if the book was just a thought experiment or if it really was written by a group of secret government scientists. The SR-72 Dark Star. The SR-71 Blackbird was developed by Lockheed Martin during the Cold War as one of the most technologically advanced machines on the planet. It set both speed and altitude records that lasted for decades, and to this day still has insane capabilities. The stealth spy plane is built from mysterious exotic alloys and looks a lot like a spaceship. The SR-71 has a successor, the intensely secret SR-72 Dark Star. This is a hypersonic jet that can provide unparalleled air reconnaissance for the United States Air Force, although we won't see it in action probably for another decade or two. It was proposed in secret in 2013, and it hasn't actually been fully developed yet. We're expecting a test flight by no later than 2023. However, it is possible that the vehicle could already have taken to the skies without public knowledge. The spy plane should be able to reach a top speed of over Mach 6, and it has a cooling system embedded inside of its engine that will be able to fire hypersonic missiles. This thing will be able to move over 6 times the speed of sound while firing missiles that move even faster. And it could be the absolute most advanced war machine the world has ever seen. Hangar 18. Hangar 18 is a secret government facility even more mysterious than Area 51. Its official name is the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and nobody except a few high-security government officials and the workers at the base know what's going on. It can be found just outside Dayton, Ohio, and is swarmed in rumor and speculation. Hangar 18 is only one building on the larger base. It's in this hangar where people believe the government is hiding physical evidence of UFOs. They not only think that the debris from a spaceship is there, but also the possible corpses of the aliens that had originally piloted the craft. The extraterrestrial bodies could very well be hidden inside of an extremely secure part of the hangar called the Blue Room. Of course, we don't know for sure if this secret military facility really is holding aliens. Material obtained from the world-famous Roswell, New Mexico crash in July of 1947 is said to be held here. This was confirmed by Oliver Henderson, a former military pilot, when he claimed to have flown a plane loaded with debris, along with several small alien bodies, to the base. The government has denied any kind of UFO knowledge, but people still remain skeptical, and hope remains that there are other beings out there. Russian laser beams. In 2011, Russia supposedly began working on a secret weapon codenamed Kalina, and for the past decade, they have been working on the weapon non-stop and revealing very few details about it. It's believed to be an anti-satellite weapon, something that can take out satellites like a BB gun can take out grasshoppers. Now here's where things get interesting. Recent images captured on Google Earth allegedly show the construction of this powerful Russian weapon. It was discovered in the open at Russia's Ministry of Defense's Krona space surveillance complex. It's from here where Russia uses a system that provides targeting data to all their satellite systems. It's been around since the 1970s, although it didn't become fully operational until the 2000s. Documents appeared in 2014 suggesting Kalina was a weapon to functionally suppress electrical systems using lasers. And in 2017, more documents appeared describing Kalina as a space security weapon. Putting all these clues together, it does appear that Russia is working on some kind of ultra-powerful laser beam that can take down assets in space. It's hard to say exactly what the plans are for this weapon since there is still such little evidence. However, it is completely possible that it may be utilized by Russia in the near or distant future. The Secrets of FEMA. Harry Truman began the Federal Civil Defense Administration in the year 1950. Their initial task was to prepare the country against the threat of a nuclear attack. They were essentially emergency management, and they were the ones who began to set up nuclear bunkers across the country, hoarding supplies and stockpiling goods in case of an apocalypse. As the years went by, it became pretty clear there weren't going to be any nuclear missiles landing in the United States, and so the FCDA turned into the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, in 1979. They were often tasked with responding to natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. So here's where things really start to get secretive. FEMA was officially designated as the government's response team for all natural disasters. However, their real task was still coordinating national security in the case of a more global catastrophe. Over a third of its workforce, as well as the majority of the funding, was hidden within the country's classified black budget. Only 20 members of Congress knew of the agency's true purpose. Fast forward to today, it's still not exactly clear what kind of secret stuff FEMA is up to. What we do know is that they have been lurking in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia since the 1950s at their secret hideout called Mount Weather. What really goes on there? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. A bird in flight. Project Aquiline was a secret CIA program behind the development of a highly advanced stealth drone that looked like a bird in flight. It was an aerospace project kept out of the public eye. However, it may not be completely dead. Rumor has it that some of these drones could still be collecting dust somewhere at the secret Nevada base known as Area 51. According to unsealed CIA documents, the drones were intended for the collection of intelligence, and because of their design, they could secretly monitor unfriendly skies without suspicion. The project's engineers attempted to simulate characteristics of a bird to remain undetectable in enemy territory. Flight testing was set to begin in early 1971, and they proved to be quite successful. The drones were so challenging to observe in the sky, they even had to paint one of them neon orange so that the plane chasing it could see it more easily. However, the project would never reach its full potential. Ultimately, Aquiline was halted due to the rising cost to develop such advanced technology. Another $35 million in funding was still required, and because of this, the project was cancelled. The designs were made, a series of prototypes were developed in the 1960s, but none of them ever reached operational status. The Sea Shadow. The Sea Shadow was inspired by the F-117 stealth aircraft. The head of Lockheed's Skunk Works, Ben Rich, wanted to design new military technology. This new project would include concepts from his work on aircrafts as well as submarines in order to create something completely original. The plan was to create a stealth vessel that could cruise over the surface of the water and be completely undetectable to sonar without having to submerge. At first, the Department of Defense was not all that interested in Rich's ideas, but eventually they were persuaded to try it out. DARPA made a contract to build the craft, which led to the extremely secret development of the Sea Shadow prototype, also known as the IX-529. It was assembled inside a submersible barge off the coast of Redwood City, California. The first test began in 1981. However, the Sea Shadow proved to be a massive disappointment. It created an unexpectedly large wake behind it that could easily be seen from the air, as well as on sonar. It was discovered that the problem was largely due to the propellers being installed backwards. Revisions were made and the vessel was finally completed in 1984. Throughout 85 and 86, the Sea Shadow underwent night trials. However, the stealth ship never made it past the testing phase. The public first set eyes on the vessel in 1993, and testing continued until 2006, when ultimately the whole idea was scrapped. Thanks for watching! What kind of crazy military projects do you think are going on now? Let me know your guesses in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time! Bye!